Thank you for attending our first session of the Eyes on Every Ballot Election Observer training sponsored by the Virginia Project. I'm Ned Jones, and I'm the Election Integrity Director for the Virginia Project. The Virginia Project is a partisan political action committee that is dedicated to helping to rebuild the Republican Party in Virginia. As a part of that effort, tonight and for the next three Thursday evenings, we're conducting four 30-minute training sessions for election observers. We hope that our training will enhance all the other training that's available for election observers being conducted by the state, the Republican Party, the political campaigns, and other groups in Virginia. Tonight, in our first session, we're going to cover some of what happened last November and why we need an army of observers with eyes on every ballot. In all 133 plus in-person early voting CAP centers, those are the central absentee precincts, for all 45 days of early voting and absentee ballot processing, and in all 2,451 precincts on election day for the election that starts in 36 days on September 17th. Since the early hours of November 4th last year, the Virginia Project has been focused on investigating what happened in the 2020 election. Our research has revealed many irregularities and anomalies, and we believe that we will eventually find voter fraud. Voter fraud is extremely hard to prove after the fact, but we have found so many flaws in our election system and have discovered so many, shall we say, irregularities in the election that the potential and likelihood of fraud is obvious. There are three ways to fix the fraud facilitating issues in our election system: legislation, litigation, or observation. You can forget legislation in Virginia until we take back our state government. This year, our legislature and governor passed additional fraud facilitating election laws that make it much easier to cheat. As for litigation, the GOP doesn't seem to pursue this remedy like the Democrats do to try to change election laws. It may just be a question of available resources. So that leaves observation and the reason we are here tonight. With eyes on every ballot, we will mitigate the potential for fraud. Here are some of the irregularities that we have discovered in our analysis of the 2020 election. These irregularities are the reason that we need an army of observers in the upcoming election. One area of our research is a mass mailing performed by the Center for Voter Information, a nonprofit left-leaning organization located in Washington, D.C. They mailed out over 2 million absentee ballot applications to voters in Virginia. They mailed out millions of absentee ballot applications in at least 24 other states. They had a special arrangement with the Postal Service. Their mass mailings were sent in bulk mail, and any undeliverable pieces of mail were not physically returned to them. Instead, the Postal Service sent them a list and a reason why the mail pieces weren't delivered. We refer to this list as a list of unlikely voters, those who are registered to vote in Virginia, who have either moved, died, are listed under a maiden name, and so forth. It's very possible that someone voted for these voters. We will be watching for any voter who shows up in this year's election without an ID. And we'll get more into the ID situation shortly. As is well known, a record number, 61% of voters voted by no excuse absentee, mail in, or early in person voting in the November 2020 election in Virginia. We have done an in depth analysis of the daily absentee ballot file. This is an enormous file that lists every application for an absentee ballot and every absentee ballot that was recorded and every early in-person vote by date. We have found that many Virginia voters have more than one absentee application listed in the file. We see 3, we see 5, 7, as many as 11 applications for one voter. We also see over 400,000 applications that were canceled or deleted. Now, the explanation for the canceled ballots or applications may be that the voter applied for an absentee ballot and then decided to vote in person, either early or on election day. The other possibility is that someone other than the voter was submitting all these applications. In many cases, a voter decided to vote early and showed up to vote early in person with or without their requested absentee ballot. They have to turn in their absentee ballot, and at that point, it becomes a spoiled ballot. If they don't have their ballot, they may have to vote as a provisional voter. We have heard in many cases that the spoiled ballots were not disposed of properly, so that you actually had live ballots in the early voting center that were not marked spoiled. We'll be watching this process very closely during the 45 days of early voting this year. Another area of concern is voters who have moved and who are still registered to vote at their old Virginia address. We analyzed the National Change of Address file for one of the House of Delegate districts in Virginia. This file is a listing from the Postal Service of everyone who has filed a change of address. We found approximately 8% of the registered voters in this one district had a change of address, many of them out of state, yet were still registered to vote in Virginia. If you take 8% of our approximately 6 million registered voters, that's 480,000 people. And even if that's a high number, half that number statewide would be significant. These registered voters who have moved are potential fraudulent voters. Again, we'll be watching voters who show up without an ID, either early voting or on election day, very closely. Another area of concern for us is voter rolls maintenance. The Department of Elections is to maintain the voter rolls in Virginia. And the voter rolls were not cleaned up, that is, removing voters who have moved, died, listed under a maiden name, felons, non-citizens, and so forth, 90 days prior to the November election last year, as required by law. The Department of Elections said they could not update the voter rolls because of COVID. Since November, approximately 360,000 voters have been removed or their status changed to inactive. We believe many more should be removed. These voters who should have been removed are potential fraudulent voters. Once again, we'll be watching for voters without an ID very closely. One of the requirements in our election system is that voting machines are tested prior to every election. This is called logic and accuracy testing, commonly referred to as LNA testing. Last year, all 133 electoral districts were required to test their voting machines by a very specific deadline prior to the election. We sent out a FOIA request to each district and received their testing and accuracy reports. Many of our 133 electoral districts did the testing on time, but 28 of them were late and 10 did not test their machines at all. In Prince William County, none of the machines were tested, so their voters went in and voted on machines that were not tested as required by state law. We want to be sure that every district tests their equipment by the deadline this year and that we have observers at every location for every one of these tests. We've all heard about the dark money that was used in the November election from third-party organizations. We have tracked down all the Mark Zuckerberg, owner of Facebook, grants that were sent to Virginia. Zuckerberg and his wife, Priscilla Chan, gave $350 million to the Center for Tech and Civic Life, a small, politically progressive, nonprofit organization in Chicago. Virginia received nearly $4 million in the form of these grants to 39 cities and counties. Most of the grants, nearly 90%, went to strong Democrat locations. Many of these locations have leftover funds, and they will be using them for drop boxes, additional staff, and satellite voting locations in the coming elections. We're watching this issue very closely and will be observing these activities, especially the drop boxes, in the coming election. We want to know how the ballots are transferred from the drop box to the counting location and be sure there is a chain of custody. The Virginia voter laws are very fraud facilitating. We no longer have a voter ID law in Virginia, thanks to our Democrat legislature and governor. You no longer need a photo ID to vote. As a matter of fact, you don't need any ID to vote. All you need is a utility bill with the voter name and address on it. And if you don't have that, you can still vote by signing an ID confirmation stating that you are the voter. The form even says the only required information is the printed name and signature. The voter is signing this form subject to a felony charge if they are lying. These records are kept under seal with the circuit courts, and you need a court order just to get the count of how many of these were signed in the last election. We'll be watching these voters who signed the ID confirmation very closely. We'll want to know their voter ID number and follow up, even if the state doesn't. So these are some of the reasons why we need an army of trained, respectful, but aggressive observers for the election that starts in 36 days. Next Thursday, August 19th at 7 p.m., we'll have our second training session and cover the specific duties of the 3 election observer types: election officers, poll watchers, and seasonal workers. The following Thursday, August 19th at 7 p.m., we'll discuss how you apply for each position and the required training for each. And then on Thursday, September 2nd at 7 p.m., our last session, we'll talk about the specific things you'll be looking for and what actions you can take to mitigate any potential fraud. We want our observers to have the potential for fraud in the back of their mind as they watch the election this year. Before we answer a few of your questions, we want to keep this session as close as we can to 30 minutes. I want to mention the Virginia Fair Elections Election Integrity Summit, which is being held in Richmond on August 20th and 21st. We'll be participating in the summit, and we encourage you to register at summit@virginiainstitute.org. That's summit@virginiainstitute.org. Thank you very much for coming. We appreciate you being here and look forward to seeing you next week.